you. So the topic today was creating thought patterns, change your thoughts, change your environment. And so I was thinking about it. Do our thoughts actually affect the way that we interact with things? And I was kind of meditating on that. Does the way we look at the world, does our perceptions, is the lens that we put on, when we look at things, does that actually affect, how we look at things or what we find meaningful? What do you guys think?
Yes, of course.
Like 100% resounding? Does anybody think otherwise? And just because it was just such a big yes, I mean, you guys now got to tell me why. Why do our thought patterns affect things?
Maybe because it's like we're speaking it into the universe. It's like
Mm-hmm.
even though it sounds like our voice might just be sound, like we have so much power and
Mhm.
influence with kind of what we say. That could affect like our subconscious, but can also like kind of like put a dent into like some other higher thing that's listening to us and making us happen for us.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty profound. I like it. Anything else?
I think reality is based a lot on perception,
Mm-hmm.
and everybody's perception is individual based on your own experiences, and
Mm-hmm.
that ultimately shapes the way that you think about things in general. So I think in that aspect, yes. But I also think that there's an aspect that cannot be affected, and that's the one that kind of connects us all, where,
Mm-hmm.
like morals, for example, right? People with just like moral understanding that something's wrong. You don't need to necessarily go through a certain experience to understand that that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Even though some people do, not everybody does.
Mhm.
And I think that it's kind of like the balance between the two things.
Mm-hmm. So if you know something's wrong or you have a certain perspective on something, I don't know, if a bus is driving down the street and you're standing in the middle of it and then you have a thought that something's wrong and then somebody says, hey, there's a bus coming. As soon as you hit that thought, if you really understood what was being said, you move out the way, right? So there's a way in which thoughts are actually performative too. What we view in the world actually affects the way we act, interact, and so on, right? Okay.
That just reminds me of a saying. A hostile person lives in a hostile world, and
Mhm.
a loving person lives in a loving world.
I love it. And actually, when I was thinking about this question, I was watching Avengers Endgame. Has anybody seen that movie? It's a good one. There's a scene actually where the Hulk, he's like, spoiler alert. Sorry, it's been out for too long. If you haven't seen it, you should. But Professor Hulk comes out, and in the scene, they're all sitting there, Black Widow, Captain America, just kind of looking at him, and it's like super odd because normally when the Hulk's green, he's super angry, and they're like, "Well, what happened?" And he's like, I used to think of the Hulk as a disease, and I always used to think I had to get rid of him, and then I changed my perspective and actually started seeing the Hulk as a cure, and took the brain and the brawn and melded and meshed it together, and something wonderful happened, and I was like, whoa. But a lot of that, there was two realities. Obviously, you had Bruce Banner, and you had the Hulk, who was always angry, and a lot of the reason that he was always so angry, and so was Bruce Banner, was just simply a perspective. And then as soon as he shifted his perspective, there was like this whole transformation, which obviously the end game was allowed to take place. But the reason I like that is because in a lot of ways, the perception that we have about our own lives, what's negative, what's positive, what's good, what's bad, is all shaped by the knowledge or information that we feed our thoughts, right? So like bunnies eat carrots, right? What dogs eat dog food, and our brains eat, or our brains are fulfilled and nourished by what? Knowledge. Yeah, knowledge. Real knowledge. And actually that's from a Vedic perspective or for an ancient world perspective, ultimately our knowledge or the things that feed us are clarity that arrives in real knowledge. So it's like, if you've ever been confused and you've really been trying to I've worked in sales, so you'll be sitting there trying to close a deal and then somebody will give you a little hint, or I don't know, you're just confused about something and then somebody wants to help you out and they're like, hey, did you know this? And then all of a sudden your perspective completely shifts and you feel just completely calm in that scenario. Right? Has anybody ever experienced that? Like you're going through something and then you ask a buddy for some help and they give you a different perspective and you're like, oh dang, I never even thought of that before. And so that's actually a symptom of who we actually are. So when we're fed real wisdom, then there's actually a sense of clarity or illumination that happens within ourselves. And I found that obviously with very, just normal, everyday things. But I've also found that where I've been struggling with something for maybe a year, and then all of a sudden this idea just hit me, and I'll be like, oh my God, that's it. And then that wisdom actually has an entire effect on my whole body. And so with that in mind, I thought maybe we could look at, so obviously the way we look at the world, just to recap, the way we look at the world affects the way we interact with it. Everybody's cool with that still? Okay, cool. And I thought we might look at a little different perspective or maybe challenge some of our own ways that we may look at the world in accordance to what could be considered like an Eastern or Vedic perspective. And so, there's there's a spiritual text, it's called the Bhagavad Gita. There's what's called Sankhya Yoga. And you guys say Sankhya?
Sankhya.
All right, so Sankhya. It's a way to break down the world into its smallest parts. And so if we were going to look at the Sankhya of a cake, it would be sugar, flour, maybe some vegan milk, some almond milk, maybe some vanilla. And so within the Bhagavad Gita, the Sankhya philosophy that's talked about is a way that they break down the world, but from a much larger perspective. So what constitutes our reality? In the West, we engage in Sankhya. There's a particular way with regards to our minds and our bodies that we look at the world. If you listen closely, I just told you. So does anybody know what that particular way that we look at the world is in the West?
Their minds and our bodies.
Boom! Ding, ding, ding! Yeah, that's the traditional way that the West breaks down the world. There were minds and there were bodies. And ultimately consciousness or who we are is simply our personality. And when we fade away, that, essentially as soon as your personality leaves, it's a big question as to whether you're still there or not. In the East, which is again based on the sacred knowledge of the Bhagavad Gita, there's one last component. So you have the mind, the body, and then does anybody know what the last part is? Your spirit, which could also be known as
Atman?
yeah, oh dang, okay. Atman, Jiva, okay, I see you. So yeah, but I mean, in more simple terms, it could be our consciousness, who we are, the observer that exists inside of the body, that which permeates the entire body. And so, yeah, you have the mind, the body, and then consciousness. So the body, the mind, and then consciousness, spirit, Atman, Jiva, soul, and so on. And so I thought, we all have a conception, knowingly or unknowingly, we all have thoughts that drive our interaction with this world, that, again, unknowing or unknowingly, stem from ultimately where we actually think our value comes from. And so I thought we might go through each one of those, and we'll kind of do our own little personal test and see kind of where on the spectrum we think we are. You don't have to say where you think you are. You can keep it to yourself, but let's go through it. So we've got the body. What happens if I think I'm the body? What happens if my thoughts are very bodily focused and I think that I'm the body? I think that my happiness is derived from the body. What are the byproducts of that? I mean, what does that even mean, to think I'm the body?
You're defining yourself based on the way people perceive you, not really the way you perceive yourself, because you're not on the outside looking at yourself. And the other people are.
Okay.
Materialism.
Let's go even, let's not even overthink it. What does it mean to think that you're the body? What are you? What's your gender? Female? Does anybody here think they're female? What about the males maybe there's nobody in here that thinks that they're male. Does anybody think they're male in here? Okay. So we're getting somewhere. Okay, what else?
Sensory attachment.
I mean, that's really heavy. Sensory attachment. What is that? What does that mean?
Do we interpret the world through our lid?
So, I mean, I have eaten McDonald's in forever. I mean, literally decades. But it's you see a lot of people nowadays, going along with what you were saying, they're very, they have a really hard time controlling what they eat, right? And so they feel like when they're able to feed themselves, that gives them some sort of sense of self-worth. And then that obviously could take you to a very dark place. What are some other ways that we define ourselves?
Our jobs.
Our jobs, okay.
Religion.
Huh?
Religion.
Religion.
Politics.
Our politics. Oh, I'm a Democrat. I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat.
Well,
America. Wealth. Your education. But is that really a bodily thing, or is that more of the mind?
no, that's not.
That's more of the mind thing. All right, let's just stick with the body. I like that. Education, we're going to use that one.
Where you come from?
So your culture, your ethnicity. Nobody ever has any problems with where people come from, right?
Not here.
No. If you're born in a black family or a white family or a Hispanic family, that's not a problem that exists right now, right? Based on just a bodily conception. All right? No. Right? So, obviously, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm looking at what it means to be the body. Despite, all the thoughts of being something greater than the body, it seems like a lot of people, if I took a real honest survey, maybe not you guys, but a lot of people within this world kind of have this bodily conception that they really identify with where they come from, how much money they have, how they feel like that creates value for them in society. If people don't have that same status or wealth or social standing or skin color, then there's a lot of division that happens. Is that something that you guys all notice, or is that only in my own mind?
I guess also body physique.
Physique, body image, literally thinking that you're the body. People working out for hours just to snap. Look in the mirror, snap that on Instagram, hashtag that, right? Right? People have a lot of issues with body image. It's a serious thing. It's not just Instagram chat. People like because they're either overweight or because they don't feel like they're skinny enough. They have all sorts of, really severe mental illnesses that come from that. So I mean, it's kind of funny if you got like a buddy that's posting his or her six pack a little too often, but it's like a severe thing. I mean, I think it goes back to what you were saying about that sensual sort of experience and really defining yourself by that sort of conception, that thought, and not having anything higher to really kind of sink your teeth into. All right, so maybe let's try out the mind now. So we kind of looked at the body. If you really identify with the body, it seems not to lead to such a great conclusion if you're super attached to it. Obviously, if you think it has a utility, you take care of it, you eat, what's necessary, you don't go overboard. There's a lot of benefit to having a body. Don't you agree? I mean, I think so. So, what about the mind? What happens when we judge each other based on the mind? You mentioned intelligence.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Cameron.
Cameron? Very nice. And what's your name? Yeah.
Luis.
Luis. All right. You guys have been giving such great answers. And sorry.
Sarah.
Sarah. Okay. I'm not going to remember everybody's name, but I'm going to try. These bodies, all right. So what about the minds? So intelligence was one thing we mentioned. What happens when we judge people purely based on their intelligence? Yeah, stereotype. Yeah, you judge. What happens if your mind runs off? We got a lot of that in America when people's minds are very in control and they have a hard time controlling them. They're very ego-driven, but I'm talking about just the basics. Depression, anxiety. I mean, these are like real things that stem from the mind. Right?
Division.
What was that?
Division. Separation.
Yeah, separation.
Division.
Yeah, so based on intelligence, if, it's like, well, what does that even mean? Right? It's like, if it's just based on intelligence, well, intelligence relative to what? It's like if we're trying to build a skyscraper, I don't think anybody in here is an architect, but if you're not, you're pretty stupid pretty quick, right? But if we're talking about maybe art or business or so many things, now all of a sudden everybody has a place in the world. So intelligence is such a relative thing. And then when you think of intelligence, does that just mean rational intelligence? What if you're more emotional? What about that? Now what? So intelligence, is so varied. It's like, how do you find any sort of, if we judge people on that, do we find that a lot of issues arise because people think they're more intelligent than others?
Yes.
I have a question for you, actually. Do you think emotional intelligence is a symptom of the mind or the soul?
Let me think about that. That's a good question. Yeah, let me think about that. That's a really good question. All right. Anything else with regards to the mind?
About like a belief system.
Yeah, your beliefs. That's a big one. We're talking about change your thoughts, change your environment. We got a lot of people with really strong beliefs that aren't maybe based on a whole lot of evidence nowadays. Right? So thoughts are so all-pervasive. It's a lot of what we're talking about, but obviously our thoughts affect so much of the reality that we feel we're a part of. That can be based on a bodily conception, that obviously can be based on a mental conception. And if you guys aren't agreeing that we can just kind of keep it at thought, we're going to be a little lost, because we just ran out of options according to us of how we should identify and what we should identify with. Maybe that's why there's so much depression and anxiety out here. And so we can take it a step further and maybe look at the Vedic view based on these ancient, spiritual literatures, based on what people have been, understanding about reality for thousands and thousands of years, that maybe there's some wisdom, there's thoughts that you could have that are beyond the mind and the intelligence, that are beyond the body and these bodily conceptions. That actually, and what's interesting is we all agree with this in some way. We may not break this down in the sort of way that I am, or that, based on the Vedas that I'm, really into, but everybody believes in equality. And if you look at that based on the mind and the body, certainly you can't take two people and, scientifically, because keep in mind, if everything's just based on our mind, then everything's just based on our senses, right? The mind just being the sense. So you can't say, oh, well, it's equality based on something greater, but then say that the mind is the only thing that exists. Because as soon as you say that, then now you're acknowledging that there's nothing actually beyond the mind. And so based on the mind and the body, it seems that there's actually no equality. That those things actually, if you just took scientific tools and measured it across all people across all times, you couldn't take even identical twins and make them equal. Because one might be a little bit more intelligent and one respected than another. I mean, 1 equals 1, right? So as soon as you say 1 equals 1.1, they're no longer equal, right? You say 1 equals 1.00001, that's no longer equal. So when we're sitting here thinking, oh, I actually feel like there's something deeply intrinsic to everybody that makes them equal, it's like, well, what are we talking about? And the Vedas would actually say that equality that we're perceiving comes from something that's beyond our mind and our senses, because when you observe those things from a scientific or a practical lens, you can't really find that equality. And so, in that respect, it's like, okay, if there's all deeply something inside of us that makes us truly equal, truly profound, something that's truly greater than all of us, how does that thought change your worldview? When maybe somebody's super caught up in like being black or being white or being rich or being poor or being this or being that, and you have this conception that actually there's something much greater in them than that temporary perspective that they might hold. That there's actually something fundamental and beautiful and maybe clear, full of goodness, that maybe is just kind of covered over by these false thoughts that they're actually just their body. How might that change your world or your worldview? What do you think? What do you think? I've been looking over there and you look like you got maybe a little something to say. Nothing? All right. Any thoughts?
There will be no hatred. If you see them equal, there won't be any hatred or prejudice. We love them automatically.
Yeah. At the very least, you might have a little bit of compassion for them, because you see what they're caught up in. It's like all of a sudden, if you don't identify with those things, then when you see them identifying with it, then you think, oh, maybe they just don't have the proper knowledge of what they really are, right? You don't get so caught up in anger because you actually don't think you're the body, or you actually don't think you're intelligent. So if somebody's like, oh, you're so stupid, it's like, no, I'm actually like greater than my intelligence, right? And so it can actually be more. And I find, and I could be wrong, that when you actually start acquiring a set of language to start being able to look at things within the world, that actually becomes the basis of emotional intelligence. Which is why when you get real, what we would call transcendental knowledge, yeah, that transcendental knowledge which creates the perception of the self does give you the proper intelligence or emotional intelligence to understand how to interact with all of the people and just beings in general. Because ultimately, if you're going to learn a subject matter, what's the first thing you're going to do? If you don't know anything about finance, what's the first thing you do for like the first 2 or 3 weeks?
Learn the basics. Go to Google.
What does that mean, to learn the basics?
The fundamentals.
What does that mean?
Vocabulary.
You literally have to learn the vocabulary. And that's actually a indicator. It's indicative that you actually have at least some idea that you know what you're talking about. For anybody who's ever studied something in depth, you can automatically tell if somebody knows a decent amount about a subject matter by how they talk about it. And so spiritualists or aspiring spiritualists, to have the proper thoughts and the proper perspective, I think it's important that we start developing a vocabulary and a language by which we can not only observe ourselves, but that language, that the definitions, the ways and perceptions and lenses in which we view the world actually start corresponding with that vocabulary, the way that we identify with these things. And so, obviously, the Bhagavad Gita is such a sacred text that goes through a lot of rigor to, quantify and talk about thoughts and how we should think and how those thoughts result in actions in a very, again, in my opinion, profound way. Obviously, again, as we seek to explore language, the more eloquent that somebody can describe something, the more profoundly we feel like they understand it. And in a lot of senses, that vocabulary actually gives you the nuance. When you talk about emotional intelligence, too, it's like you go in and start learning, like, oh, that's anger. Oh, that's jealousy. That's envy. And then in your mind, you actually start, oh, I'm feeling envious. Therefore, or I'm feeling angry. And then you start being able to unassociate your emotion from the phenomena and just being able to say, no, I'm just angry or I'm happy. And you actually learn a language to start being able to talk about your emotions in a very profound way. And so it's the same thing with spirituality, that, when we do these exercises and we allow ourselves to go deeper, when we're able to maybe eliminate some of the thoughts that we have, preconceived notions, just like if somebody thinks that they're super emotionally intelligent, but, is always angry, like the Hulk, he all of a sudden was able to create kind of a different perspective, and that actually changed the way that he was able to interact with people. And so in the same way, we have a lot of Sanskrit around these parts, but the Hare Krishna mantra is one such mantra that encoded within the language that we use, there's a certain potency. That's why words hurt when you know what they mean, right? And so, a lot of, again, us uncovering meaning within this specific tradition is, really getting into and allowing ourselves to be open to not only how our thoughts and perceptions in the world could be influenced, but then also maybe how they can be changed so that we can actually allow ourselves to transform. And this mantra is one such tool that helps us actually start going through each one of our thoughts, about maybe how we identify with the body, or maybe how we identify with our intelligence, or our fame, or our beauty, and actually go a little bit deeper and see how those things are actually connected to something really divine. And that's what this Hare Krishna mantra is. Krishna means the source of all attractiveness, but spiritual attractiveness. Rama means the source of all pleasure, or all enjoyment, but spiritual enjoyment. Enjoyment that's actually nourished by love and the self and the Atma and something much deeper. And then also that Atma in relationship to its divine source. So, I think we should take time to figure out what things mean to us. We should take time to figure out what our thoughts are about things, and give it a shot. It might actually transform the way that you look at some things and create a more meaningful, peaceful journey for you. So, thank you guys so much. Hare Krishna.